Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Mental Health Mondays, brought to you by Saving Grace Community Church and Grace House Cincinnati, a nonprofit agency and ministry of Saving Grace Community Church. I'm Pastor Trevor Phillips. Along tonight, as always, our resident professional, Dr. Quentin Moss, MD, President, CEO, and founder of Modern Psychiatry, and an all-in-all around cool brother. Good evening.
It's good to be here tonight, man. Thank you.
Awesome. A lot of things that have happened since we were together in the news and in the media. And one of the things that really has come to light is just how many people are stressed and have been traumatized by recent events, this pandemic, the election. And for many people, this period has awakened those thoughts has awakened those feelings, and have brought back memories and flashbacks of other traumatic experiences. So tonight we will be talking, and we will be dealing with tonight carrying the weight of PTSD, carrying the weight of post-traumatic stress disorder. I think what I need to say, Dr. Moss, and certainly you will agree, that whenever you are diagnosed with a chronic condition, or even a condition that is life-altering, that changes you and affects your whole makeup, that there is a weight, there is a burden at times in waking up to the realization that the condition that I had yesterday, the condition that I had last week, the condition I had last month, last year even, is still with me. And certainly seasons, holidays, and as I said earlier, current events exacerbate and awaken things that lay dormant and put them front and center. And so as we look tonight at PTSD, share with us, Dr. Moss, and to describe, if you will, in general, what is post-traumatic stress disorder?
You know, post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder. But in saying that, it's really a brain condition. You know, there are many diseases that we see in mental health where we can have a list of symptoms that people experience, and then we can also see that list and correlate it to significant brain changes that we see in testing and neuroimaging. And this is one of those conditions. It's a condition which someone experiences a traumatic event, and we can talk a little bit later about what that event might be. And it creates this constellation of 4 areas of symptoms. And these 4 areas of symptoms are: one, re-experiencing the event. So people tend to have very intrusive thoughts, meaning thoughts that come into the mind that they feel like they didn't ask for, they can't control. They have flashbacks where they may experience that situation all over again, where they may feel and smell and see things that look just like that event. And they may have very vivid dreams, which could be night terrors or nightmares, where they feel as if they're unsafe, and their body responds to that in the midst of their sleep. Then there's another constellation of symptoms of avoidance, where we may have avoidance of people, places, things, conversations, anything that remotely reminds us of that event. And then there is hyperarousal or reactivity. And this is where we see dramatic challenges in how people may engage with others and how they may experience socialization. So people can have difficulty with always feeling on edge, always feeling tense, have a tendency to respond disproportionately or out of proportion to a situation, have difficulty with rage and anger and significant mood symptoms. And then there's the issue of cognition and mood. What I mean by cognition is their ability to recall or even remember the event. The event is hazy, foggy, they can't remember certain details, or they may also have significant mood symptoms where people can be depressed and have lack of joy and a lot of numbing. We see all of those things combined together, creating this phenomenon or this syndrome of PTSD. Usually we see these symptoms together for at least a month before we're able to make the diagnosis of that.
Well, certainly a lot is said about PTSD. And one of the things that has been really interesting during this pandemic is how people have stepped to the forefront and been very transparent about a myriad of mental health issues. And certainly persons that are popular, who are famous, suffer and deal with the same type issues as the average layperson and the general public. And when we look at PTSD, certainly that rings true. Notably, we know that Whoopi Goldberg suffers from PTSD after having witnessing two planes collide in midair. And as a result of witnessing that horrific event, she is hesitant, understandably so, because of her frame, to even board a plane anymore. And so, and another person that really suffers from is perhaps one of my favorite actresses is Gabrielle Union. And here's what Gabrielle Union had to say about her encounter and the cause of her diagnosis.
I was diagnosed with PTSD at 19 after I was raped at gunpoint, and I didn't let it stop me. I didn't want it to define my whole life, and it doesn't have to. Asking for help, needing help, doesn't make you weak or less worthy of love or support or success. You can literally be anything you want to be. PTSD isn't a death sentence. You don't have to be alone or feel isolated. There's so many of us out there who are dealing with exactly what you're dealing with, and it doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you anything but human, and we all have something.
What do you see in that, just the humanity, and you also see again how this particular disorder affects common folk. It affects those that have enjoyed a high level of success and stardom. It affects everyone. And so as we look at the causes of post-traumatic stress disorder, we heard from her, and her issue was simply at being at 19 years old and having gotten raped. What are some other things that cause and bring on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder?
She's mentioned, sexual trauma, which is a common cause of PTSD. And as a matter of fact, people who experience sexual trauma tend to have longer illnesses associated with PTSD. But it's, people who witness violence, people who see people get assaulted or witness domestic violence or in the military. And there's always the threat of violence if you're not in violence itself. Sometimes we can, unfortunately, have violence when we see something on television that's actually real. And 9/11 is a good example of that, how many people were traumatized by what they saw going live, on that day. But, even as children, there are other things that can create this element of trauma. Food insecurity is a big trauma. Having neglect is also a big trauma. Being in a situation where you are overly policed, or being in an environment where there's ongoing violence, though you may not experience it, but there's always the threat of that violence ongoing that can also create trauma. So there are a number of different scenarios where people can experience trauma that affects our brains, and then of course affects our behavior, and we experience symptoms.
Well, interesting enough that this being Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, recognizes the day in which the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on that a very distinct day in our nation's history. It brings in mind that those that were in war often suffer from PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
A study was done back in 2015 that stated in JAMA, Journal of Academy of Medicine, I believe, Association, and this spoke about how 4 decades or 40 years after Pearl Harbor, that 270,000 folks that served in the war zone themselves still suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly war is one of those causes. So even Dave, give me some symptoms. What does that look like? I know from a personal account, my father served in the Korean War conflict, and shortly after that was married to my mom. And she shared that early on in her marriage, sometimes he would have some nightmares, and he would be saying things in his sleep that really resembled his time in live action and combat. And so as we look and we discuss, give us a deeper look into what it looks like for a person, what you mentioned earlier, flashbacks, what else, how this disorder may manifest itself.
You know, one of the things that's very common, people who suffer from this condition, is the feeling that they're always on edge.
Mm-hmm.
And when they feel like they're always on edge, they're always feeling as if they're on alert. There's always a sense that there's danger somewhere. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
where that danger is. I don't know when it's going to come. I don't know how it's going to come. But I always feel as if there's some threat that's behind my shoulder that's going to come at any given time. So when sometimes people struggle in going into crowded places, feeling as if there's going to be danger there, going to restaurants, having to sit in a way that they can see everything that's going on with their back to the corner, you know?
Wow.
And with that sense of hypervigilance, then it makes us, unfortunately, hyperreactive.
Wow.
So if there's something that occurs that looks like a threat, our response to that is going to be much bigger than what the threat may be. And unfortunately, it may not even be a threat.
Okay.
What tends to happen is that, you know, there are a couple areas in the brain. You could think of one area of the brain that takes a picture, right? That holds a memory, and it holds what things look like, what things smell like, what things feel like. And when we have a trauma, our brain takes a picture of that event, all that we experience with that. And then as we go through life, it's constantly looking at how we engage with the environment, and it's matching up our current experience against that picture. And if there's anything that kind of resembles that, it creates a tripwire in which we have a response to that that's much like the original trauma. Has really nothing to do with what we're actually experiencing in the here and now. So, you know, it creates, you know, changes in the brain that actually cause some places in the brain that actually used to cope and to manage this mechanism, used for survival, but now it's gone awry. That area actually shrinks over time because of the stress. And hence we get difficulty in managing our emotional responses and our physical responses to the environment.
Wow. You mentioned memories, and sometimes just being in a situation that because the weightiness and heaviness of the traumatic event has dominated our lives so much that I can imagine someone who may have been in a crowded building where there's a fire, or
Hmm.
just kind of controls them and just affects them in the decisions they make, to even make sure that in that situation things don't happen.
Right.
I learned a short time ago, and perhaps you can allude to this, about the hippocampus in terms of what that does in the brain and memories. Can you explain that part of the brain and how that may affect our dealing with traumatic event?
So the hippocampus is talked about this area of the brain that kind of takes the picture.
Mm-hmm.
So the hippocampus kind of stores those images, those
Mm-hmm.
feelings, and all that was around that particular event.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, and part of the hippocampus also, in storing those events, tries to put appropriate emotional responses with that event. So it creates a way of coping and storing.
Mm-hmm.
When we don't have significant trauma, we're able to experience something, and then our hippocampus, retrieves this previous image of the past and says, "This is the emotion that's supposed to go along with it." Whether
Mm-hmm.
it's an emotion of enjoying something or being stressed, that's the emotion that goes with that image. When the hippocampus is affected, because it's had this trauma, is short-circuited to some degree, that it doesn't have a healthy way of managing the emotions that go along with the traumatic image that we experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So when we are, as I mentioned, are going through life and we have our current day experiences, when they match up against what we have in our files in the hippocampus,
Mm-hmm.
is exaggerated. So we end
Mm-hmm.
up getting an exaggerated response.
Mm-hmm.
And that another part of the brain called the amygdala, that's
Okay.
supposed to help us cope with some of
Mm-hmm.
this and allow us to be able to process information and have an appropriate response, that also has become heavily impacted,
Wow.
such that it is also not working well. So then we're on, DEFCON 10 on
Mm-hmm.
high alert all the time
Mm-hmm.
without having these mechanisms in our brain, which were built for to help us to manage that. Those things are greatly impaired. Though they don't have to stay impaired,
Mm-hmm.
they're greatly impaired.
Yeah, and and I focus on that particular aspect in terms of the flashbacks, because so many people miss out on relationships.
Oh yeah.
They may have been, God may have sent someone their way, or they may have found a soulmate, but because of a poor experience or bad relationship, horrific event, something traumatic happened in that relationship, they can attribute, because I really want to make this real to our viewers, they can attribute and assign their memory to the present situation,
Right.
where it may not be applicable.
That's right.
Hearing you speak about this, it's like having an infected file that you may bring up from the motherboard, your memory, and then you try to open it,
Hmm.
but it's no of use because it's been affected.
Relationships is a big area, romantic relationships. But,
Mm-hmm.
another place that we see
Mm-hmm.
this play out a great deal is in the workplace.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So having a sense of always having a perceived threat based
Mm-hmm.
on how someone says something about the body
Mm-hmm.
language of the person that you're talking to. And you may perceive a threat from them, and it allows you to respond in a way that's less than professional,
Mm-hmm.
less than productive.
Mm-hmm.
And we may not have the big blow up where we're tearing stuff off the walls or yelling at people, but we can have responses in which we become increasingly and unnecessarily very timid, or we may
Mm-hmm.
have responses in which we can become overly aggressive. And so we have these scenarios play out in the workplace, and we're competent, we're
Mm-hmm.
qualified for the position, but
Mm-hmm.
because of this trauma, it affects how we engage with people, and we go from workplace to workplace to workplace,
Mm-hmm.
not realizing that there's this challenge that we have within us that needs some treatment so that we can be the best we that we can be.
That's an interesting thing, because in the whole hippocampus and pulling up those memories based on our life experiences, If we've encountered or if we have bought into media stereotypes or how people have portrayed, we can pull that in as a part of our bringing up that deleted file. In workplaces, you mentioned, perhaps, and speaking as a person in my demographic, an African American male, perhaps if I'm expressing myself in the work environment where I am the minority demographic, uh, I may come off threatening if I express myself legitimately with a very even tone
Hmm.
because of how an African American male has been portrayed. Or on the converse of that, if I've had dealings with and I've been so overwhelmed in what I've seen in the media or experience, if you're female, you may become an angry black female. You may be a white male or white female who was in a authoritative position, or you're a boss or a manager or have subordinates, and you have someone who has been traumatized by interacting with other folks from the opposite race.
I think that the symptoms of PTSD are more pervasive than we realize, and
Hmm.
I hope that people will perhaps take an account of some of the things that they've experienced, and
Hmm.
may consider going in for an evaluation to see if
Hmm.
it's something that needs attention, needs treatment.
Hmm. Because certainly it, unchecked or not dealt with, can damage relationships, and sometimes we can read into things that are not there, or we can assume the role of the victim and say, Sarah, Sarah, what's going to be, and remain silent when we really should be speaking up. Um,
But PTSD has other effects too,
mhm,
Pastor.
mhm,
And one of the things that we see when we do studies is that people
mhm,
who suffer from PTSD, they are not able sometimes to reach a high functioning baseline.
mm, mm,
So they struggle more with unemployment. They struggle
mm,
more with poverty,
mm,
and then they also are at risk for other mental health conditions. Not only that,
mhm,
but PTSD by itself, is a risk factor for obesity, is a
mhm,
risk factor for diabetes, for heart
mhm,
disease, for
mhm,
chronic pain syndromes. So it
mhm,
creates also this cascade of other medical conditions because the body being on in this high intensity, hypervigilant state, always
mhm,
being tense and on edge, releases all of this cortisol, releases all of this inflammation, and
mhm,
our body continues to marinate in that with
mhm.
significant health consequences.
So, in terms of treatment, one of our questions that came in is, besides therapy, what are the other treatment options for PTSD besides therapy?
Besides therapy,
Hmm.
there are medications that have been shown to be very effective in treating PTSD. We think antidepressants are medications that treat depression, but antidepressants are ideal for the treatment of PTSD. And we find that certain antidepressants that affect serotonin in the brain more than
Hmm.
others are more effective. So medications like sertraline or Zoloft or paroxetine, Paxil or fluoxetine, Prozac, among some others, are effective medications when used carefully to be able to help people to recover from PTSD. And people can recover, and people do.
That's good news. That's good news. I think one of all of those drugs, and I was rolling with you, pretending to know what you were talking about in terms of those drugs, but a bell did go off, and that is Prozac,
Yeah.
which is very commonly prescribed. Tell us a little bit about Prozac and what's its function, and how it sits with other drugs in terms of treat PTSD.
Prozac, within that class of serotonin reuptake inhibitors,
Hmm.
its goal is to find a way to make serotonin more available in the brain.
Hmm.
And serotonin, when it's not modulated or regulated well, has been implicated in having significant mood symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and the medications, when prescribed, they don't make us anybody different. They, should not change our personality. But what they do is allow for the brain to use this particular neurotransmitter or brain chemical more effectively.
Okay.
And we find that when people are on these medications and dosed appropriately, they can experience, a resolution of the symptoms or start to feel better. And these are medications that may be prescribed for months or maybe longer, depending on the individual situation and the severity of their condition. But these medications for most people are tolerated well. Prozac gets a bum rap. When people talk about stigma, they throw out Prozac.
Right.
But, before we had Prozac, we had other medications that we prescribed. But since the advent of Prozac and antidepressants, actually, it's clear in the literature that the rates of suicide actually went down as we started to prescribe these medications more. So these medications do help improve symptoms, help improve quality of lives, and help us to be safer when our illness is pretty severe.
I'm having trouble hearing.
So let's just say that I've been listening to our discussion tonight, and you've mentioned a few things. What other things might I be checking off to see if I'm suffer from this disorder, if I'm making a checklist?
If you have had a significant trauma, and again, trauma doesn't have to be, being in war or seeing someone killed. Again, trauma is this sense of I'm not safe, somebody else wasn't safe. And I have this, difficulty with irritability, changes with my mood, difficulty with sleep, feeling a great deal of anxiety or nervousness, having a sense of dread or doom, or as if something's going to happen to me. If I'm experiencing some of those things, then I should check in with my primary care doctor. That's always the best first place to go. I should check in with my primary care doctor to see if I may have this condition, and then they can make a referral on. But one of the things that creates resilience, meaning an ability to recover, and being also an ability to be able to have trauma and not be as heavily impacted, are a couple of things.
Okay.
So one is having a belief in something much greater than you. Spirituality and faith has been shown to be a resilience factor.
That's good.
Two, having a great deal of support around you, right? So not having to suffer these symptoms alone is also a resilience factor. And then being able to talk or articulate what you're experiencing also creates a great deal of resilience. One of the things that you talked about, Pastor, in this study was talking about folks who had gone to war, and one of the war conflicts that we had, where we appeared to have folks who came back from combat, who suffered PTSD, and they had these lasting, very complicated course of this illness, are our Vietnam vets. So when we experience trauma and we don't receive support, which means we did not receive support coming back, they were actually re-traumatized by, society when they came back.
Yeah.
Being in a conflict and feeling helpless about, what you can do in that situation. And many of the vets that I've talked to, different from vets in other conflicts, felt very helpless. They didn't feel a sense of purpose with that conflict. Created, I think, great complications for that. That, of course, not having treatment readily available as we do today for those guys when they came back. So getting the treatment, getting some support, making sure that we don't have this sense of helplessness, are important to make sure that people are able to recover.
That's great, because you're right. In terms of the Vietnam War, it's often said that they returned without a hero's welcome.
Oh, yeah.
And they were often villainized because of what they had done. It's hard to believe, but we're at 30 minutes. It's been an awesome time. I know. We're just getting warmed up.
That's right.
So I want to thank you tonight, and I want to thank those of you who have watched us tonight. And hopefully, if you would like some additional information, or you want to be referred, you can call 513 513-332-5522, 513-332-5522, or you can call Modern Psychiatry, and that number is?
You can call 513-299-4053. That's 513-299-4053.
Thank you very much. So we hope that you have been helped. And as always, we want to encourage you to feel better, live better, and become better.